Today's scripture reading is from the book of Genesis, chapter 32, verses 22 to 31. Jacob got up during the night, took his 2 wives, his 2 women servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the Jabbok River's shallow water. He took them and everything that belonged to him, and he helped them cross the river. But Jacob stayed apart by himself, and a man wrestled with him until dawn broke. When the man saw that he couldn't defeat Jacob, he grabbed Jacob's thigh and tore a muscle in Jacob's thigh as he wrestled with him. The man said, "Let me go, because the dawn is breaking." But Jacob said, "I won't let you go until you bless me." He said to Jacob, "What's your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name won't be Jacob any longer, but Israel, because you struggled with God and with men and won." Jacob also asked and said, "Tell me your name." But he said, "Why do you ask for my name?" And he blessed Jacob there. Jacob named the place Peniel, because I've seen God face to face, and my life has been saved. The sun rose as Jacob passed Peniel, limping because of his thigh.
This thing tends to drive me nuts. I don't know about you, but I have a love-hate relationship with my phone. Now, make no mistake, anyone who knows me will confirm that if I can't find my phone, if it's not somewhere on my person, or heaven forbid, if I lose it, which I have a time or two, I begin to get shaky. Good or bad, my phone has become an extension of me, and truthfully, that's mostly bad. I think if we're honest, most of us would admit that our phones have taken over much of our attention and an unhealthy amount of our free time. And yet, just as truthfully, I need my phone, for there's absolutely no way that I could juggle 2 demanding jobs without having the remote capabilities that a good, fast smartphone provides. But this phone, it drives me crazy sometimes. It drives me crazy because it never seems to stop ringing or beeping. Even when I turn it on vibrate, there's this constant zzz rattle reminding me that text or Facebook messages or phone calls are coming through, whether I acknowledge them or not. Turn it off, you say? Okay. Only to be bombarded when I turn it back on. So which is worse? Handling incoming calls and emails and messages as they come in, or sitting in ready position as I turn it back on? I do both. But the crazy I've experienced the past couple of weeks relative to my phone is this newest iPhone software update. I wondered if our friend Johnny Elam would be here, who manages the Apple Store at Fayette Mall. But I'm guessing that these software updates occur in most smartphones, except for the Galaxy 7, which has completely died. But it seems to me that with Apple, it recurs a lot. And my OCD will not allow me to ignore that little red circle on my screen, which means I'm always one of the very first to update the new and improved software. But you see, every time I update my phone, it takes me at least a couple of weeks to get used to the changes that Apple has promised will make my phone more usable and my life more simple. I drudgingly then perform the update, and I grit my teeth, powering through frustration and self-doubt as I convince myself that I'm just not smart enough to have a smartphone. And many times I just give in. And so I call a teenage niece or nephew who can explain things or fix my phone in a matter of seconds. And that only confirms that intelligence is not the issue. It's pure and simple. It's my resistance to change. Change is hard, isn't it? We all know that. Whether we're adjusting to an iPhone update or trying to change our eating or exercise or work habits, change is hard. I have a good minister friend who graduated LTS with me and is in the Midwest now. And she, like me, has been battling weight and lack of exercise and balance of life and work for years. And she, like me, has been particularly really striving to do a better job of eating and do a little better job of exercising and get some of the weight off. And I read this week on my phone, of course, I read from her Facebook post that she had been to the doctor. And the doctor told her that if she was tired of starting her diet and exercise regime over time and time again, then maybe she should stop quitting. Do I need to say that again?
No, that was good.
Ouch. Change is hard. And change is really hard when you get to the deeper core, isn't it? When a partner or a friend gives you honest feedback about your attitude or your actions with a clear indication that you need to change. It's hard to hear that we need to change, and it's even harder to do. When we leave the doctor's office with news that our condition is chronic, and the best we can do is to slow down the degenerative deterioration of getting older. When we're told to change how we've always done things physically, that's hard. When our companies downsize and we either lose our jobs or the increase in job demands makes us so work weary, change is hard. And yet, as hard as it is, we seem to be drawn to that possibility. With all the mixed noise and messages we're hearing with these political campaigns, there's one consistent message on all sides, is there not? Change. It's always been that way. Candidates promise to make changes which will improve our individual and collective lives. We'll remember in 2008, the slogan for President Barack Obama's campaign was, "Change we can believe in," with the slogan tag coming after it, "Yes, we can." Political consultants know that using the word change, Kenny, they know this, I'm going to give you a clue here. They know it can evoke responses. Way back in 1968, when I was only 6 years old, presidential candidate Hubert Humphrey coined the campaign slogan, I love it. Some people talk change, others cause it. From iPhones to campaigns, from careers to relationships, here's what we know. Change is inevitable. Now, how we deal with it and how we use change for the better, well, that's up to us. Our scripture this morning concerns one of the more popular Old Testament characters, Jacob. And by the time we get to our reading this morning from chapter 22 in the Genesis story, Jacob already has quite the storied past. He's cheated his second older twin brother Esau out of the birthright, which caused Jacob to flee his homeland. Escaping from the father he tricked and the brother he lied to and stole from. Jacob flees his homeland and sees a woman that takes his breath away in Rachel. and agrees to work for her father Laban for 7 years in order to gain Rachel's hand in marriage, only to have the tables turned and have Laban trick him. And so instead, Jacob gets the older sister Leah, who he did not think was near as pretty. So it required Jacob to work another 7 years so he could have both Leah and Rachel. Now then, it's a separate sermon. But here's another story for the conservative Christian marriage folks who rely on Scripture to define what traditional marriage is. Jacob continues his storied journey by acquiring wealth and family heirs and an overall good life. And then he gets into a dogfight with his father-in-law Laban, resulting in Jacob fleeing once again. Now remember, he's already left his birth family because of his deception of them, and now he's forced to leave his newfound homeland because the two of them were incredibly greedy and tried to trick the other one out of livestock and wealth. A side note, that never works out well, even when it seems like a brilliant idea. So here's where we find Jacob in the story this morning. Jacob decides he's going to return home to his biological roots, back to Esau, the brother he cheated. Now he had to know his brother Esau was still pretty miffed. And so he thought, I'll just send him some gifts. And I'll have them delivered before my homecoming. That'll soften the old brother up. Now notice this, because it's buried a bit in this story, but so intentional and so important. Jacob was headed back for a family reunion, and he thought that sending some material worth would soften the blow of the long-held grudge and the vindication by his brother Esau. In other words, Jacob hadn't changed much, had he? Years ago, it was his misplaced priorities of wealth that got him into trouble with his family to begin with. He was so focused on getting more of his inheritance that it justified him lying to his aging, blinding father and cheating his twin brother. And now, having learned not one thing, Jacob was on the return route back to his homeland because he was so intent on adding to his wealth that he tricked his father-in-law Laban. And my study Bible titles that section of the story, Jacob Prospers at Laban's Expense. Jacob. He was one hard-headed son of a gun, wasn't he? You'd think he'd learned his lesson about greed and dishonesty, misplaced values, and misordered priorities, but he hadn't. We know this because here he is again thinking that if I just send my brother Esau some livestock and worth, we'll all be singing Kumbaya. Listen as I read the passage right before our story this morning. Chapter 32, verse 3. Jacob sent messengers before him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, in the country of Edom, instructing them, "Thus you say to my lord Esau, thus says your servant Jacob, I have lived with Laban as an alien and stayed until now. And I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, male and female slaves, and I have sent to tell my lord in order that I might find favor in your sight." That's the message he sent. And here's what he heard back. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he's coming to meet you. And 400 men are with him." Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him and the flocks and herds and camels into two companies, thinking, if Esau comes to the one company and destroys it, then the company that is left will escape. As the story continues to unfold, Jacob is posturing for his return home, deciding to send even more livestock, dividing his family into two, so if one side was demolished by Esau's army, the other half of Jacob's family could escape and survive. And what we see is after all this planning, Jacob was exhausted. And so we read, he himself spent that night in the camp. Note here, the wives, the children, the grandchildren, the livestock, all had gone ahead of Jacob, and here he was alone. He had calculated his best strategy for survival from his brother Esau's wrath, and having sent them all ahead of him for his reunion, Jacob camped out alone. And that, my friends, that is where we find the heart of today's story. Verse 24. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Have you ever been a part of an all-night wrestling match? Perhaps a wrestling match that sometimes occurs in the light of day. A wrestling match that occurs with an unnamed enemy like the one unnamed in this story. Have you ever thought that you've calculated and planned and had it all figured out your way, only to find a total disruption? You see, friends, Jacob didn't have a great history. And worse, it didn't seem like he'd learned his lesson. He continued going along with the ancient beliefs that the more land you had, the more wives you had, the more descendants you had, the better. And the fact is that while we certainly have our basic living needs, our essential needs of shelter and food and health, material things will never fulfill our lives. Ever. I'm reminded over and over of things my dad taught me. And one saying I recall when I got my first big job. His daddy saying, now Marsh, as you move up the corporate ladder, don't you step on people to get there. Because you might find yourself coming back down the ladder. And you'll meet those same folks again. Hold tightly onto that value in my career. In our story, Jacob had seemingly figured it out, sending material things ahead of him to soften his old brother Esau. Yet, notice what happens. Before any reconciliation could begin, Jacob needed to change. So in spite of all the wealth, in spite of his seemingly clever idea to send gifts to Esau, what Esau really wanted to receive was a changed brother. He wanted to see a brother who was sincerely sorry for stealing and cheating and lying. He wanted to experience a brother who no longer put value on ancient ideas of wealth, but instead a brother who was reflective and courageous enough to see the error of his ways, to recognize his misguided thinking and beliefs, and to imagine the possibilities of the future. You see, friends, it was because of that all-night wrestling match that Jacob was changed. It did take all night and a misplaced hip socket. But Jacob was persistent and said to the man he was wrestling, I will not let you go until you bless me. Doesn't that tell us that Jacob knew in his heart he was messed up? His priorities were not right. His values were way out of line, and his soul was empty. Finally, after years of searching, deception and cheating, fleeing home and fleeing home and fleeing home again, Jacob realized he needed to change. And finally, what we see in this story is that he got the guts to do it. Wow. I want those guts. We fast forward to the long planned reunion, and what a beautiful picture. Remember now, Jacob knows that his brother, his miffed brother, and 400 men are on their way. Jacob looked up and saw Esau coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and 2 maids. He put the maids with their children in the front. That'll preach too. Then he put Leah with her children and Rachel and Joseph last of all. He himself went on ahead of them, bowing himself to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him. And they wept. Who knows if we would have seen this same reunion had Jacob returned to his homeland, standing upright and marching proudly back to his brother, touting all his worldly accomplishments, instead of limping into the realities of forgiveness and reconciliation with humbleness and a changed heart. This picture, this beautiful picture of estranged brothers weeping, emerges from a long night of wrestling and a resulting limping leg of the one who needed a restart, a life software update. Phone updates and life updates. Change is hard. Change is really hard. But if we manage in some way to wrestle with change effectively, we will limp right along into all God's possibilities. Limp with me, church.